A pile of bones behind a wicker fence. That is literally where this story starts. And somehow, that pile of bones behind a wicker fence is the direct ancestor of Stonehenge, of star charts, of accurate maps drawn thousands of years before anyone thinks maps were possible. Welcome to Co-Pilot Podcasts. Today, we are pulling apart the origin and role of Kindred Courts, specifically how hunters' caches evolved into geometric centers for invention, astronomy, and cartography, what the women of the Paleolithic actually built and why it mattered, and how a round loom hanging from a tree branch at dusk might be the most important scientific instrument in human history. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this research, and I want to start with the most basic question possible. What even is a hunter's cache?
So a hunter's cache is exactly what it sounds like on the surface. It's a structure built at the site of a kill. When a kindred group, following migrating herds across the landscape, brought down a large animal, they couldn't carry everything back to camp. So the men would build a cache right there at the kill site. They'd wicker around, basically weave a fence of branches, and dedicate a stay-behind team to guard it. The choicest cuts went back to the kindred camp, but the cache held everything else.
So it's a temporary storage solution. A refrigerator made of sticks, essentially.
That's a pretty good way to put it. And here's where it gets interesting, because the kindred needed to keep up with the migrating herds. They would pack everything up and move to the site of their freshest kill. So the cache didn't stay temporary for long. The whole community would arrive at the cache site. And that is where the story of Kindred Courts actually begins.
Okay, so the community moves to the cache, and then what? How does a kill site become something more permanent?
This is the part that the research describes as almost inevitable. The cache was backfilled with bones, suspect meat, offal, unused bits of hide, basically organic waste. And where you find human habitation, no matter how transient, you find human waste. And where that waste includes the cast-offs of favourite forage, seeds, fruit scraps, root vegetable peelings that forage sprouts and grows. So the kindred would return to the same cache sites season after season, following the same herds along the same rivers, and they'd find their favourite root vegetables and fruit trees growing lush right there on the mound of the old cache.
Wait, so the garbage heap was accidentally a garden?
Accidentally at first, yes. But the research is very clear that it didn't stay accidental. The figure used to represent the kindred matriarch, called Guinevere in these narratives, after the Gaelic tradition, she put two and two together. The berries and root vegetables that sprouted directly on the mound of the hunter's cache grew lush. And it didn't take long for her to realize that helping the process along by planting seeds and transplanting varietals for future use was wise. That is the origin of horticulture, and it traces directly to the hunter's cache.
So Guinevere is essentially the first horticulturalist, and the hunter's cache is the first garden bed.
Exactly. And what she built around that original cache mound is what the research calls omnitecture, a word coined specifically for architecture that serves every community purpose simultaneously. The mound wasn't just a garden. It was a root cellar, a community square, a defensive structure, and eventually a monument, all at once.
Omnitecture. I love that word. Break down what that actually looked like physically, because I'm picturing something pretty modest, and I suspect I'm wrong.
You are wrong, yeah. Reading from the mound outward, you first have the mound itself, constructed on a pile of rock, not just dirt, which is critical for drainage. On top of the rock pile, a thick layer of topsoil. Inside the mound, an interior vault and entry tunnel constructed of enormous stone slabs. The entry tunnel was large enough that an adult could walk through without stooping, with arms almost fully extended on both sides. The interior chamber had ample headroom and could fit a dozen adults sitting around a central fire pit.
That is not modest at all.
Not even close. And then surrounding the mound, a ditch that collected rainwater and drained waterlogged soil, which also functioned as a little moat that rodents wouldn't cross. The spoils from digging the ditch were piled into ring mounds where additional crops were planted, and the outermost feature was a palisade of wooden poles, which kept deer out, but also, if planted with thorny varieties like hazel and crabapple and berry vines, became an impenetrable defensive barrier. The research describes it as barbed wire by any other name.
So it's a garden, a food storage facility, a defensive compound, and a community center, all growing out of a wicker fence around a pile of bones.
And the mound garden itself was doing something even more sophisticated than just growing food. The research describes 3 distinct growing zones on the mound's surface, each receiving different amounts of sunlight. The northern side was darkest, the The western third received less intense light, and the eastern third got the most direct sun. And Guinevere used those zones deliberately, crops that thrived in late summer conditions on the eastern third, early summer crops on the western third, spring crops on the northern third. She was essentially running 3 seasons simultaneously on a single mound.
That is genuinely sophisticated agricultural thinking. That's not primitive at all.
And it goes further. Because the mound's sloped surface receives fuller sunlight earlier in the day than a flat field, Guinevere's crops were basking in sunshine almost from sunrise, while flat-field crops were still in morning shade. The research predicts that when you combine all these advantages, the extended growing day, the extended growing season from the angled slopes, the perfect drainage from the rock base, you'd see at least a 25% increase in annual yields compared to a modern farm. And in the Upper Paleolithic, when the Ice Age was bearing down across Europe, that 25% was the difference between life and death.
Okay, so we've established that Kindred Courts were these remarkable multi-purpose communities built around mound gardens. But I want to get to the part that genuinely surprised me when I first encountered this research, the astronomy and cartography angle. How does a garden mound become a center for stargazing and map-making?
This is where it gets really beautiful. And it starts with something incredibly simple, a round loom hanging from a branch at dusk.
A loom, like a weaving loom.
Exactly. Weaving was one of the foundational technologies of the Paleolithic. The research argues it's likely the first discipline perfected in the material sciences. And round looms were everywhere. They had a warp strung like spokes of a wheel, radiating from a central knot. Now picture this, it's early evening at a Kindred camp. The sun has just set, the stars are beginning to appear. A mother hangs her round loom from a low-hanging branch of a nearby tree. And in that transitional hour, when meticulous tasks are set aside and people are talking and observing, someone notices that the warp of the loom aligns with something in the sky.
And they start marking it.
They start marking it. The research describes it as a question by a fire pit led to a hypothesis, and a hypothesis led to an experiment. Someone left their round loom tethered to that branch and daily marked the warp where it intercepted with the sun, the moon, or a wandering planet. Over many months, the pattern those plots formed was what the research calls the celestial lotus, a geometric pattern produced by tracking planetary movement across the night sky. And that pattern became the astronomer's grid.
So the loom is literally the first telescope, or at least the first systematic observational instrument.
The first grid for recording celestial positions, yes. And here's the leap that the research emphasizes. Once you have that celestial grid, cartography is not far behind. All Guinevere had to do was apply to the earth what she had applied to the heavens. Place a mountaintop at the center of the round loom instead of the moon, and you can measure and record the direction and distance to any feature in the field of view. The round loom becomes a surveyor's compass.
That is a genuinely elegant connection. The same tool, the same grid, applied first to the sky and then to the landscape.
And the research describes the specific technique used to make accurate maps, called soloromancy. The process is almost disarmingly simple. You plant a staff upright in the ground beneath the sun. You place a stone on the tip of the staff's shadow. Later in the afternoon, the shadow has moved, and you place a stone on the tip of the new shadow. Draw a line between the two stones, and you have a perfect east-to-west line every time. The research claims this technique remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites.
More accurate than GPS? That's a bold claim.
It is bold, and the research presents it as a direct comparison to the method the United States Army still teaches in basic training. The argument is that because the sun is the frame of reference rather than a satellite signal, there's no atmospheric interference or signal degradation. Once you have that east-west baseline, you use the head of your staff as a surveyor's instrument, align a string from the staff to a landmark on the distant horizon, and trace the azimuth. Repeat from multiple locations, and the intersecting lines produce a contour map of the region with remarkable accuracy.
And this is what the soloromancers were doing, the priestly caste dedicated to interpreting solar phenomena.
Right. And the research makes a fascinating point about how this was perceived culturally. Because the sun was the exclusive instrument of divination, cartography wasn't regarded as a science, it was regarded as a sacred act. The soloromancer's staff was a holy object. The maps they produced were divine revelations. But strip away the theological framing, and what you have is a systematic, repeatable, accurate surveying methodology operating tens of thousands of years before anyone in mainstream archaeology thinks it was possible.
And the Kindred Court is where this all converges. The mound is the high point from which you survey. The fire pit evokes the sun. The picket fence of the original hunter's camp functions like the trilithons of Stonehenge.
That's exactly the argument. The research states it directly: Stonehenge is omnitecture, and it is certain that Stonehenge enjoyed apex importance in the scientific community of its day. But it is, in the end, just an improvement on the hunters' camps of the Paleolithic. The pickets of the fence built to ward off hyenas function in the same manner as Stonehenge's trilithons. The compass of the camp was defined by the compass of light from the fire burning at the top of the cache. Everything else is a spirited dance around a kindred fire.
That reframe is kind of staggering. Stonehenge is a very fancy hunter's camp.
A very fancy hunter's camp that also happens to be a precision astronomical instrument and a community centre and a monument. Omnitecture, all the way up.
Let's talk about the physical evidence for all of this, because I know some listeners are going to want something they can point to. What do we actually have in the archaeological record that supports this picture of Kindred Courts as centers of cartography and invention?
The most compelling physical evidence comes from what are called cup and ring stones. There are tens of thousands of them in the British Isles alone. These are stones carved with concentric rings and cup-shaped depressions, and they've been interpreted for a long time as ritual objects, religious symbols, astronomical markers in a vague sense. But the research presents a very different interpretation.
Which is?
Plat maps. The research describes a specific cup and ring stone on display in a local museum in Durham, England, and argues that it is a plat map documenting the individual kindred courts of a specific region. A plat map, for anyone who doesn't know the term, is an official document recording property lines, the kind municipalities use to prevent boundary disputes. The research argues that cup and ring stones were exactly that, indelible documents recording the kindred courts of a region, their mounds, their ditches, their relative positions.
So they're not religious carvings, they're land records.
Land records and more. The research describes them as functioning like spreadsheets used to plot and document crops being planted, estimate yields, plan and record harvests, and track tribute payments in the form of dried food stocks. The term used is exchequer, borrowed from later English history. Guinevere and her ladies weren't just gardeners, they were economists maintaining permanent financial records carved in stone.
Okay, that is a complete reframe of what these stones are. And the Durham stone specifically, the research claims it matches the actual geography of the area where it was found?
That's the claim, yes. The research describes overlaying the stone's pattern against a map of the immediate vicinity, a few hundred acres along the river flowing through Durham, and finding a near-perfect match. The mound gardens documented on the stone would have fit within the boundaries identified. The number of rings on the stone corresponds to the number of mounds and their ditches in the landscape.
And this same iconographic writing system, using cartography as the basis for a visual language, is what the research traces across the ancient world, not just Britain.
This is one of the most sweeping claims in the research. The argument is that this iconographic writing system was in use prior to 1500 BC on every continent except Antarctica. The research documents it in Wales, in Iberia, in Egypt, and argues for a single source point in Indonesia following the Toba eruption around 77,000 BC. The Egyptian gods, in this framework, are not mythological figures. Each one is a bust depicting the regional geology of Africa in what the research calls anamorphic similes. The head of Horus, for example, corresponds to a specific geological formation west of the Nile that resembles a perched Egyptian black kite.
So the Egyptian pantheon is essentially a set of regional maps wearing headdresses.
That's the argument. And the rule of syntax the research identifies is the king had to look like the kingdom. If your kingdom's geology resembled a pintail duck, the head of your king was always depicted as a man with a pintail duck's head. The headdresses of archaic rulers weren't ceremonial decoration, they were cartographic identity markers. The constitution of the realm had to look just like the realm it documented.
That is a completely different way of reading ancient iconography, and it all traces back to the Kindred Court as the place where this system was developed and maintained.
Exactly. The Kindred Court is where the soloromancer practiced. It's where the round loom was hung at dusk. It's where the cup and ring stones were maintained as community records. It's where the celestial observations were made and translated into cartographic surveys. The court was the institutional centre of everything: horticulture, food storage, defence, community governance, astronomy and map-making. All of it in one place, all of it growing from that original wicker fence around a pile of bones.
I want to pause on something, because I think there's a counter-argument that a lot of listeners are probably forming right now. The mainstream archaeological view is that these mounds are passage tombs, ritual sites, places where ancient druids performed arcane ceremonies. The research we're discussing pushes back hard on that. How does it address the evidence that archaeologists point to? The human burials, the animal sacrifices.
The research doesn't dismiss the burials, it recontextualizes them. The argument is that if mound architecture derives from hunters' caches, then it was inevitable that beloved community members would be interred in and around these mounds. The research specifically argues that the individuals buried beneath mounds like the Bryn Celli Thi mound in Wales were revered master gardeners, people whose knowledge and stewardship of the mound was so valued that interring them there was a way of enshrining them as saints of the community, blessing the garden into perpetuity.
So the burial isn't a religious sacrifice. It's more like being buried in your life's work.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And the bull buried outside the entrance to the Bryn Celli Thi mound, which archaeologists interpret as a ritual sacrifice, the research argues is simply evidence that Guinevere understood fertilization. If burying a prized bull blessed a mound with abundant growth, that's not superstition, that's composting. It's organic chemistry without the chemistry degree.
Right. And the Bryn Celli Thi pattern stone itself, the one buried face down beneath the mound, that's another example of recontextualization.
Yes. The research describes that stone as an obsolete map that was repurposed as a buttressing stone for the interior vault. It wasn't buried as a sacred relic. It was recycled as a building material once the map it contained was superseded by more accurate surveys, which is actually a very practical, unsentimental thing to do with an old document.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea that these mounds fell out of use when commodity grain farming arrived in the Bronze Age, because that's a really interesting transition point. What happened?
The research argues that grains were initially a novelty that Guinevere and her ladies struggled to adapt to their mounds. The yield was hardly worth the effort. But grains have one enormous advantage over the crops that thrived on mound gardens. They can be stored for years, where other crops last only months. And grain cultivation requires something that mound gardens are specifically designed not to provide: uniform light, uniform growth, uniform fruiting, uniform harvesting. Flatfield farming.
So the very thing that made mound gardens brilliant for Paleolithic survival, the staggered growing zones, the rotating microclimates, became a liability for grain production.
Exactly. Modern farmers want to get all their work over with in as little time as possible, then harvest everything at once. A garden that staggers growth evenly across a mound is irrational to a modern farmer. So as grain cultivation spread through northern Europe in the Bronze Age, the mound constructs became antithetical to the new agricultural model. They lapsed into disuse. And once they lapsed into disuse, the institutional knowledge they housed, the astronomy, the cartography, the soloromancy, began to be reframed as religion rather than science.
Which is how we ended up with archaeologists imagining ancient druids performing arcane rites, where once there were just gardens and survey instruments.
The research puts it pointedly. Neo-pagans insist that women in the Archaic are misunderstood gatherers and healers, but they bury the memory of our mothers in fantasies that evoke shamanistic shrines where once there were just gardens. The irony is that the mystical narrative actually obscures a documented truth about how sophisticated these communities were.
Let me bring in something that I think grounds this whole conversation in a really tangible way. The research mentions the Lacnunga, this venerated volume that modern Wiccans appeal to for authority. And it contains what the research calls an accurate inventory of what was actually growing in these mound gardens.
The 9 herbs charm of the Lacnunga, yes. The research argues that if the Lacnunga is truly to be believed, Guinevere was not making blood sacrifices on these mounds, but planting roots and herbs to nourish and heal her kinsmen. The specific plants named include mugwort, crabapple, plantain, chamomile, lamb's cress, nettle, chervil, and fennel. These are not exotic ritual ingredients, they are staple medicinal and culinary herbs. The mound garden was a pharmacy and a kitchen garden, not a temple. And the research suggests that environmental archaeologists should be looking for pollen concentrations of exactly these varieties in the ditches surrounding mound constructs. Right, the ditches are natural pollen traps. The research argues that unusual concentrations of these cultivated varieties in the ditch sediments would confirm what the iconographic record already suggests, that these were working gardens, not ritual sites. The work just hasn't been done yet, because environmental archaeologists have been too focused on grain pollen to look for indigenous flora.
There's something almost frustrating about that, isn't there? The evidence might literally be sitting in the sediment waiting to be analyzed, and nobody's looked because the question hasn't been asked.
That's the core frustration the research expresses. We don't know what we will find until we find it. The place to begin is at the beginning, just start looking. And the research is pretty direct about why this hasn't happened. Post-war anthropology developed a framework that reduced prehistoric people to ignorant mutes, and that framework has been so dominant that questions which challenge it simply don't get funded or pursued.
Let's talk about the cognitive capacity question, because I think it's central to why this research is so provocative. The mainstream view has been that sophisticated cartography and astronomy are relatively recent developments. This research is pushing that back by tens of thousands of years.
The research documents the iconographic record beginning in 77,000 BC following the Toba eruption in Indonesia, and it makes a pointed observation about the inconsistency in how we treat cognitive capacity. On one hand, academics celebrate the genius of chimpanzees for their instinctive ability to weave nightly nests. On the other hand, they relegate our ancestors to ignorant mutes before the Bronze Age. The research calls this post-war anthropology's self-contradicting framework, lifting up lesser primates while dumbing down humans.
And the mound constructs themselves are evidence of sophisticated cognitive capacity, independent of any writing system or astronomical claim.
Absolutely. Think about what it takes to build the Bryn Celyn mound. You have to find, then haul by hand, countless tons of rock to form the base. You construct an interior vault and entry tunnel from enormous stone slabs. You buttress it with smaller stones. You pile topsoil on top. You dig a circumferential ditch. You pile the spoils into ring mounds. You plant specific crops in specific zones for specific reasons. And you maintain all of this across generations. The research asks, amortize the cost of construction across 100,000 years, and you arrive at a new measure of cognitive capacity.
That's a genuinely different way of measuring intelligence, not by the complexity of a single tool, but by the time horizon of the planning.
And the mounds prove the point structurally. Arthur and Guinevere's mounds remain nearly perfect, waterproof, and fit for purpose thousands of years later. The research notes that the only force obscuring these mounds is the slow accumulation of debris from decomposing plant matter over millennia, what it calls the autumnal fall. These structures were built to last not decades or centuries, but potentially hundreds of thousands of years. That is not the work of ignorant mutes.
I want to circle back to something that I think is easy to overlook in all of this, the role of children in the Kindred Court. Because the research has this really vivid description of how young boys were trained, and it connects directly to the hunting and surveying traditions.
Yes, this is one of the more charming details in the research. The narrative describes Arthur kneeling before a young boy who's begging to join the hunt, and telling him, until you can hit a squirrel on the fence from the top of a mound, you can't hit a bull in the eye. The squirrel is the bull's eye. The mound top is the training ground. Young boys practice their hunting skills by trapping frogs and collecting snails in the ditch, and hunting the squirrels and birds that craved an hour alone in Guinevere's gardens.
So the mound garden is also a training range.
Another function of the omnitecture. And the children's tasks weren't just training, they were economically productive. Toddlers collected pine needles for basket weaving. Young children gathered frogs and snails from the wrong side of the moat to protect the garden while maintaining a protein supply. The research makes the point that child's play in organic culture contributed to the Commonwealth. The distinction between play and work that we take for granted simply didn't exist in the same way.
And the basket weaving itself connects back to the astronomical observation, because the round loom is a basket weaving tool. That's the elegant thread running through all of it. Weaving is the foundational technology. From weaving comes basketry. From basketry comes architecture. The teepee and the mound are structurally identical to a basket, just at different scales. From the round loom comes the astronomer's grid. From the astronomer's grid comes cartography. From cartography comes the iconographic writing system. And all of it is centered on the Kindred Court, which itself grew from the hunter's cache.
It's one continuous thread from a wicker fence to a writing system.
One continuous thread. And the research argues that this thread is visible in the archaeological record if you know how to look for it. The cup and ring stones, the mound constructs, the iconographic compositions on megaliths like the Bryn Cethli Thi pattern stone, the headdresses of Egyptian pharaohs, the gold borders on Arabian robes, all of them are expressions of the same underlying information technology developed and maintained at Kindred Courts across the ancient world.
So when you step back from all of this, and I mean really step back, what does it actually change about how we should understand prehistoric people?
It changes the fundamental assumption about what intelligence looks like without metal and writing. The research is essentially arguing that the absence of durable material culture doesn't mean the absence of sophisticated thought. Organic civilizations built from wood, hide, wicker, and earth leave almost no trace. But the traces they do leave, if you read them correctly, reveal communities that were doing astronomy, cartography, systematic horticulture, community planning, and economic record-keeping tens of thousands of years before the Bronze Age.
And the Kindred Court is the institution that made all of that possible. It's not just a settlement, it's a knowledge center.
Exactly. And here's what I think is the most important implication. The research argues that property, stewardship, and labor were all features of civilization from the most remote Archaic to the Iron Age. Cooperation is the coin of every realm which left a mark in the archaeological record. The Kindred Court wasn't a utopia and it wasn't a primitive camp. It was a functioning community with governance, economics, science, and architecture, just built from materials that decompose.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We've been telling the story of human intelligence backwards. We've been looking for the moment when people became smart enough to do astronomy and cartography and systematic agriculture. But the research we've been discussing today suggests those capacities were there from the beginning. They just expressed themselves in organic materials that didn't survive.
And the Kindred Court is the proof of concept. Start with a hunter's cache, a wicker fence around a pile of bones. Add Guinevere's observation that her favourite plants grow lush on the mound. Add the round loom hung at dusk and the celestial lotus that emerges from tracking planetary movement. Add the Soloromancer's staff and the east-west baseline drawn by shadow. Add the cup and ring stones as permanent community records. And you have a complete institutional framework for invention, astronomy, and cartography, all of it growing organically from the needs of a community trying to survive an ice age.
And Stonehenge is just the version of that framework that happened to be built in stone.
Stonehenge is the version that survived. The research is clear that by the time our ancestors hauled colossal stone slabs to the Salisbury Plain and constructed a round loom of monumental proportions, the drive to achieve precision standards in measurement had reached a zenith. But it is, in the end, just an improvement on the hunters' camps of the Paleolithic. The fire pit at the centre evokes the sun. The trilithons are the pickets of the fence. Everything else is a spirited dance around a kindred fire.
I love that image. A spirited dance around a kindred fire. And what's actionable here? What should someone do with this information?
Look at the mounds differently. If you're ever in the British Isles or Northern Europe or anywhere near one of these constructs, don't see a passage tomb or a ritual site. See a community. See a garden on top, a root cellar inside, a ditch full of cattails and frogs around the outside, a palisade of berry vines beyond that. See the round loom hanging from the branch at the edge of the clearing. See the Soloromancer on the mound top at dawn, staff in hand, tracing the east-west line. That's what was actually there.
And maybe look at the cup and ring stones in your local museum not as mysterious religious symbols, but as the spreadsheets of a functioning economy.
Exactly. Guinevere and her ladies weren't making blood sacrifices. They were doing accounting. And the fact that we've spent a century imagining the former instead of the latter says more about us than it does about them.
That is a genuinely good place to land. We started this episode with a pile of bones behind a wicker fence, and we've ended up at the conclusion that that wicker fence was the first observatory, the first survey station, the first community center, and the first library, all at once. The hunter's cache didn't just feed a kindred, it taught them to read the sky and map the earth. and the Kindred Court that grew from it was doing science long before anyone gave science a name.